Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Kelsy Burke for joining us today for this webinar, which we are super excited about. We are offering CE credit for this webinar. At the end, I will share information on how you can take the survey and how long that survey will be available for and when certificates will be sent out. I am Amber Schrader. I'm the Executive Director of ATSA, and we are super excited to welcome Dr. Kelsy Burke, who is an award-winning sociologist of religion, gender, sexuality, and politics in the United States, currently a professor of sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the editor of Contemporary Sociology. Kelsey's research has examined a wide range of topics, including debates over pornography and sex work, religious freedom laws and LGBT rights, evangelical women's ministries, and the Christian sex advice industry. Their writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Hill, Slate, The Washington Post, and other popular and scholarly outlets. The Pornography Wars, The Past, Present, and Future of America's Obscene Obsession is Kelsey's latest book. And as I turn it over to Kelsey, I did want to let you know we will be taking questions at the end. If you would put them in the Q&A box, I will be sure to get them to Kelsey when she has finished. Thank you so much, Kelsey.
Thanks, Amber. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. My thanks to ATSA for the invitation to share with you some of the research from my book, The Pornography Wars. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides with you. To get us started, I think that if you've looked at nonfiction books related to pornography, you might find that these fall into two camps, that you will find plenty of books, especially in the self-help genre, that tell you how bad pornography is for you. And then you can also find plenty of memoirs or firsthand accounts of porn stars and sex workers that provide salacious accounts of the pornography industry. So as a sociologist, my goal was to write a different kind of nonfiction book about pornography, not to change anybody's minds necessarily about their beliefs when it comes to porn, but rather to tell the backstory of where those beliefs come from. As clinicians, you might think of this as focusing in on the background noise, that is like the social and political context, as the title suggests, of individual clients' various relationships to pornography. So to start us off, I'm going to begin with a quote from Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel, Brave New World. That quote is, "A really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude." I heard this quote in a talk by a man named Donald Hilton. He's a neurosurgeon, a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, and an anti-pornography activist. His talk was titled "A Population of Slaves: How the Pornography Industry is Capturing Our Brains, Hearts, and Humanity." And it was addressed to participants at the annual National Center on Sexual Exploitation, or NCOSE, summit. So the slaves, according to Dr. Hilton, are both the consumers of porn, who are enslaved by their addictions to it, and also the performers of porn, who are enslaved through exploitation and coercion. So both the porn user and the porn star may believe that they love their servitude, but in both cases, Hilton says that they are wrong. So I've now spent over half a decade immersed in the anti-pornography movement as a qualitative researcher. So I've conducted over 50 interviews with people like Hilton who work to expose what they see as the undeniable harms of internet porn. I've observed events across the country, including lobbying efforts in Congress to end sexual exploitation in the porn industry, anti-porn conferences, a weekend retreat for Christian women whose lives have been harmed by sex and porn addiction, analyzed books, websites, scientific studies, government documents, all that voice concerns over pornography's harms. So this is one half of my research on pornography debates. A few years into the project, I decided that I wanted to put into practice something that sex worker activists have taken up as a kind of rallying cry, and that is nothing about us without us. And so in addition to the anti-porn movement, I also interviewed feminist and queer activists, sex workers, sex educators, all who work to improve the porn industry itself and people's understanding of it. I call this movement porn positive rather than pro-porn because this is not a group that uniformly supports the commercial industry. For the sake of time and hopefully a more coherent presentation, I'm focusing today on the anti-pornography movement, but I'm happy to answer follow-up questions about the interplay with this porn positive camp. So the anti-porn movement today is a somewhat strange alliance among religious conservatives like Hilton, some feminists like sociologist Gail Dines, who we'll return to later in the presentation, also secular millennial men like the online forum NoFap that you might have heard of. This is an onomatopoeia for masturbation. And all of these groups are concerned about the impact of internet pornography on contemporary society. And their arguments are really twofold, and I think we can trace them directly to Donald Hilton's presentation that's oriented around this Aldous Huxley metaphor. So because the internet makes pornography instantly accessible and also very difficult to regulate on free online streaming sites, these groups point to, number one, widespread pornography addiction, and number two, sex trafficking, both that are national crises. So in my presentation today, I'm going to unpack these claims, explain how and why they've come about, and also some of the social and political consequences that hopefully can inform your clinical work. Let's start by going back now 30 years to 1995. This was a time when only about 1 in 4 households had a computer and far fewer had an internet connection. The media was full of scary stories about the World Wide Web. It was the year of the movie The Net, which stars Sandra Bullock, a thriller. There's a villain who was a contract killer hired by cyber terrorists. And the very same month that this movie premiered in theaters, Time magazine published an exclusive cover story featuring what they touted as a brand new study by a scholar, Marty Rim, on the dangers of internet pornography. Now, the backstory of this so-called study was that it was an 85-page undergraduate research paper, possibly partly plagiarized, and it managed to get published in a law journal without undergoing any peer review. But with these delegitimizing details obscured at the time, the Time story prompted coverage in news outlets all across the country. And all were discussing the so-called findings that 85% of all images on the internet were pornographic, and many of those images would most certainly be deemed obscene by the courts. Images of children, of quote-unquote deviant behavior, including bestiality, urination and defecation, torture scenes. But in the week that followed, the internet fought back against its critic, Mr. Rim. So there were journalists, academics, and just interested laypeople who took to early versions of online message board forums to tear apart the study's findings, the analyses, the conclusions, and really to ruin the reputation of Mr. Rim, who is actually not a social scientist at all, but more of a scrappy entrepreneur who is using his sensational writings for his own success. The proverbial final nail came when the public learned that Rim had just the year before published The Pornographer's Handbook: How to Exploit Women, Dupe Men, and Make Lots of Money. So Rim, it seemed, was trying on a variety of viewpoints when it came to porn, not based on science or personal conviction even, but rather to see what would most effectively lead to his success. So now anti-porn activists could hardly come to his defense. But still, there was this dust in the air that the Rim study stirred up. Most politicians agreed that online content especially pornography, needed some sort of regulation, but they faced a challenging puzzle on how to impose them. The internet was kind of like the Wild West, a place where normal rules and expectations just didn't seem to apply. The same year that the RIM study was debunked, Senator James Exon from my home state of Nebraska introduced his solution in the form of a Senate amendment, the Communications Decency Act, or the CDA. Senator Exon made it his mission to ensure that, in his words, this is a quote, "the information superhighway should not become a red light district." So he proposed that the CDA explicitly prohibit using a telecommunications device to make or transmit obscene material or to expose children to any sexual material. So the CDA passed along with the broader Telecommunications Act in 1996. This was the first time in over 60 years that Congress overhauled federal laws that regulated telephone and also television and computer broadcast services. There was a small provision of the CDA that didn't receive much attention at the time, and that was Section 230. It states that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So this means, in essence, that website owners themselves were not to be held accountable for the content that others might post to their sites. And many of the largest and most profitable websites that we know of today really owe their thanks to Section 230. Virtually all social media sites, search engine sites. Thus far, the Supreme Court has not yet overturned or revised Section 230, but cases have been making their way through the court, so time will tell what the future will be for this important provision. This CDA provision is also what protects internet porn sites that rely on user-generated content. So on porn sharing sites like Pornhub, the world's largest pornographic website, users can either upload illegally pirated pornographic videos or ones that they've made for free. Others can watch without entering a credit card information or as needing to register as members. The site makes its money through advertisers who pay to have their banners seen by millions of daily users. Free streaming sites have to comply with requests to remove illegal content. So for example, if a user uploaded a recording of a DVD sold by a commercial porn studio, they can request to have that content taken down, but the user uploads far outpace the digital paperwork that's required by removal requests, which comes through something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or the DMCA. Today, there's some commercial porn studios that hire out firms that make full-time work just out of tracking down pirated content for removal, but still, they cannot keep up. Pornographers are committing the biggest crimes of the century, is how one activist I spoke with, Lori, put it at a large national anti-porn gathering. The gathering I call the Freedom from Sexual Slavery Conference. Both the name of Lori and the name of the conference are pseudonyms. So Lori believes that there are two main crimes being committed by pornographic websites: the crime of obscenity and the crime of facilitating illegal activities, including sexual assault, rape, human trafficking. She says, obscenity is not now, nor has it ever been, legal in this country. Obscenity in 2019 is as illegal as it was in 1919 and 1819, but nobody is enforcing these laws. Who could deny that the scenes that are readily available on Pornhub are not obscene? She goes on to say that internet pornography is a complete cesspool full of rapists and pedophiles who are documenting their crimes. She said all this to a conference room filled with nodding heads. If the laws were enforced, Lori said, pornographers would be off the streets and where they deserve to be, in jail. Back in 1973, a Supreme Court decision in a case called Miller v. California clarified the legal definition of obscenity. And at the time, over 40% of Americans believed that all pornography should be illegal. That number has dropped. In 2018, only about 1 in 3, or 32% of Americans held this view. But what's interesting is for religious conservatives like Lori, the direction of this change from the 20th to the 21st century has been the opposite. So a greater percentage of fundamentalist Protestants and other biblical literalists support outlawing pornography today than they did in decades past. The problem is that outlawing porn using obscenity laws has become notoriously difficult to prosecute, given the court's interest in protecting the First Amendment. This was perhaps most evident in the Supreme Court ruling Hustler Magazine v. Falwell that is dramatized in the feature film The People versus Larry Flynt. And in fact, many of the anti-pornography organizations that I encountered over the course of my research made a point to emphasize their support for free speech and their opposition to censorship. So instead, the primary strategy of the anti-porn movement in recent years has been to advocate for the shutdown of pornographic websites using laws against sex trafficking. In the 21st century, I've observed that the anti-pornography movement has really rebranded itself as a broader anti-trafficking movement. So every group and organization that I studied that mobilized in opposition to pornography also included explicit language about sex trafficking and how it connects to porn. So the Freedom from Sexual Slavery Conference, for example, got its start as an event to oppose pornography exclusively, but it gradually morphed into one dedicated to combating, quote, all forms of sexual slavery. So at this conference that I attended, speakers repeatedly applauded the event and indeed the overall movement to end sexual slavery as incredibly diverse, involving people of all political persuasions and religious backgrounds. But by all scholarly investigations of the anti-porn and anti-sex trafficking movements, this is really an overstatement. But it is true that these movements do attract two groups that are normally in opposition: feminists and conservative Christians. But at the same time, it's important to note that this is a movement whose leadership is disproportionately conservative Christians. So the Freedom from Sexual Slavery Conference highlighted one notable anti-pornography feminist activist, but none of the conference sponsors were feminist groups or organizations. The vast majority of both sponsors and speakers were affiliated with conservative Christianity. And yet, this event that I attended and the broader anti-porn movement downplayed the role of religion. So as Lori put it, anything religious or political just shuts people down. This is why the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, or NACOSE, where Donald Tilton spoke in the conference I referenced at the beginning of my talk, this group, NACOSE, changed its name from Morality and Media because, as Lori put it, it just didn't have enough traction. So Morality and Media was formed in the 1960s by a group of ecumenical clergy to support censorship of sexually explicit media. But today, NACOSE presents itself as a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and technically non-religious organization. They just stick to the truth, Lori said about the group, without putting Jesus on everything. So the truth of which Lori speaks is her belief that pornography and sex trafficking are really one and the same. So NACOSE, for example, uses prostitution and trafficking, what it calls the quote unquote proper terminology instead of sex work, given that according to its guiding values, quote, the commodification of sex acts is inherently exploitative. Another organization called Exodus Cry, it calls itself an anti-trafficking group, but it similarly opposes all forms of sex work, including prostitution, stripping, pornography, seeing each as what the group calls one facet of a much larger system of exploitation. It was founded by conservative evangelicals as a prayer group, but now calls itself non-religious. So like NACOSE, it's distanced itself from its religious origins. Exodus Cry you may have heard of when it created the Trafficking Hub campaign in an attempt to shut down the website Pornhub. On Exodus Cry's site, visitors can buy t-shirts, hoodies, face masks at the time, all bearing the phrase "shut it down" in letters that mimicked Pornhub's font. There were over 2 million people that signed the group's petition to shut down Pornhub and also pursue criminal charges against the company that owns the website MindGeek. That name has since changed. So anti-trafficking activists regularly turn to the state for laws to help advance their cause. This has been most notable in the federal law that is known as SESTA FOSTA. That's referring to a Senate bill, Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, that's SESTA, and the House bill, the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, or FOSTA, which passed with widespread and bipartisan support in Congress and was signed into law by President Trump in 2018. So SESTA FOSTA updated the Community Decency Act of 1996 to remove the protection granted to websites for the content of their users if that content was found to, quote, promote or facilitate the prostitution of another person. Republicans continue to propose additional legislation in the name of ending sex trafficking, though those have not been as successful as SESTA FOSTA. Senator Josh Hawley, who has since blamed feminists for driving men to online pornography and video games, he's introduced a bill that would allow individuals to sue Pornhub or other websites posting videos of them without their consent. There's been a similar law that was proposed in the Nebraska legislature last year. So critics have pointed out that these efforts in the name of anti-trafficking have the unintended consequence of actually making sex work more dangerous. So SESTA FOSTA, for instance, does not distinguish consensual sex work from trafficking. And in fact, it uses the words prostitution and sex trafficking interchangeably without adequately defining either term. Critics have also said that SESTA FOSTA is gradually chipping away at the legality of internet pornography, as pornographic websites could reasonably be found to, quote, promote or facilitate prostitution. So what the anthropologist Laura Augustin has called the rescue industry has grown in number and in influence in many places around the world. In 2020, the Trump administration announced committing $100 million to anti-trafficking organizations. Groups like the International Justice Mission, IJM, and Not for Sale claim to, quote unquote, rescue sex workers from developing countries, but they often end up channeling women into low-paying jobs where their task is to make products for Americans to buy. The sociologist Elizabeth Bernstein calls these sex workers brokered subjects, not because they're being trafficked, but because they're being leveraged by this amalgam of governments, non-governmental organizations, religious groups, feminist activists, all to further stigmatize and also criminalize sex work. So as the anti-porn movement has morphed into what insiders now call the anti-trafficking movement, it has distanced itself from arguments rooted in religion or morality and has leaned towards seemingly more objective and measurable harm to people working within the sex industry. And we can see that this is really a part of a broader trend where language of sexual health has become an acceptable and seemingly morally neutral way to talk about sex in the public sphere. So this is a slight aside, but here's data on that phrase, sexual health, and how it skyrocketed at the turn of the 21st century in usage across books, academic journal articles, and also major newspapers. And we see this language of health really taking hold in arguments about pornography consumption as well. In 2016, the GOP declared in its platform that pornography itself was a public health crisis, that's a quote, that was, quote, destroying the lives of millions. Utah legislators were the first to follow suit formally by passing a resolution that had a unanimous vote declaring pornography to be, quote, a public health hazard leading to a broad spectrum of individual and public health impacts and societal harm. Since 2016, there has been 29 states that have considered nearly identical resolutions declaring pornography to be a public health crisis. 16 have written them into state law, and most of these resolutions have received bipartisan support. In Montana, for example, it was a university student who led an anti-trafficking student group to gather signatures from Montana residents and then used draft language from Nicosi to approach a Democrat who then sponsored the resolution. It passed in Montana in 2019. So these resolutions, it's important to point out, don't change laws regulating pornography, but anti-porn activists have heralded them as an important sign of support for their cause. Gail Dines, who's a feminist sociologist and anti-porn activist, wrote in an op-ed in 2016, quote, "The science is there. By taking a health-focused view of porn and recognizing its radiating impact, not only on consumers, but also on society at large, Utah's resolution simply reflects the latest research." So opposing pornography for reasons having to do with health distances anti-porn positions from those of religious zealots who might seem puritanical or unmodern. We're not here to talk about if porn is evil or whether it should be banned, says the narrator of the documentary series Brain, Heart, World, which was produced by the anti-porn organization Fight the New Drug. They insist that the strongest case against pornography is not a religious one, but is a scientific one. So state resolutions declaring pornography to be a public health crisis base their evidence on the negative health consequences of pornography use. And all of these resolutions mention that pornography is biologically addictive, which is drawing from a framework that, as this graph shows, has become increasingly common as a way to describe pornography's harms across both scientific studies and newspaper articles. So pornography addiction, in the words of some of these resolutions, means that, quote, "the user requires more novelty, often in the form of more shocking material, in order to be satisfied." 12 of the 29 resolutions that have been proposed claim that pornography contributes to emotional and medical illnesses. Many resolutions refer to some of these specific consequences. Georgia's resolution describes pornography use as, quote, "leading to low self-esteem and eating disorders." Hawaii's resolution says pornography depicting extreme degradation and violence is such that consumers will desire it as a consequence of their addictive cravings. There are many allusions to quote unquote deviant, shocking, extreme forms of sexual desire that develop from pornography use, assuming that any porn use taints what is considered to be normal, expected, or more demure forms of desire. This language also gives the impression that quote unquote normal men would not choose or intentionally seek out deviant depictions of sex were it not for pornography's addictive qualities. The anti-porn activists that I spoke with often described what they called the AAA threat of online porn. It's accessible, affordable, and anonymous. In nearly every anti-porn event I attended, at least one speaker referenced Pornhub's own boastful statistics, which included the fact that in 2019, 1.36 million hours of new content had been added, which would take someone 169 years to watch. As an aside, after 2019, Pornhub stopped including this section they had called by the numbers, I think because it was weaponized against them so often. Pornhub and other free streaming porn sites do offer virtually limitless content, literally at users' fingertips, setting them up to binge watch or to visit sites much more frequently than they would have if they had to go to an actual like VHS rental store, as was true in the 1980s and 1990s. So today, thanks to algorithmic models, porn sites expose users to new clips, suggested search terms, and this is the perfect storm for addictive behavior as porn companies profit from users who seek more and more novel content. Fight the New Drug puts it this way, quote, "in the same way that a junkie eventually requires more and more of a drug to get a buzz or even feel normal, regular porn consumers will end up turning to porn more often or seeking out more extreme versions or both to feel excited again. And once the porn habit is established, quitting can even lead to withdrawal symptoms similar to drugs." So anti-porn groups present this science as absolutely conclusive. There is not, however, scientific consensus over how to best measure, classify, and treat problematic pornography use. So as you all likely know, neither sex addiction nor pornography addiction is a classifiable disorder in the DSM or the ICD. State resolutions that declare pornography to be biologically addictive and a public health crisis were first based on a model drafted by leaders of NCOSE. This is an organization that is not made up of scientists or clinicians, but of mostly evangelical activists. And this is really a common theme in the world of pornography addiction recovery, where seemingly scientific, objective, and non-religious information has a backstory, and that backstory intersects with conservative Christianity and with politics. So if you Google, for example, how to quit porn, you'll first likely, ironically, see a number of pornographic images and video clips, but below those, one that you'll likely find among the first search results will be a website for Covenant Eyes. Its tagline is, "Quit porn, win at life." So it's convincing marketing, but that reinforces the problem it claims to solve. And the problem, according to company messaging, is a really serious one. So Covenant Eyes stresses the physical impact pornography has on your brain. At one anti-porn conference, I picked up a brain-shaped stress ball that had the company logo from a table of swag. So this makes it seem like the damage of porn is physical and therefore very hard to reverse. This makes it all the more important to sign up for a Covenant Eyes subscription. It costs about as much as a monthly subscription to Netflix or Hulu. It's pitched similarly, so you can get the family plan for $15.99 per month. This includes unlimited devices and up to 12 users. In 2019, the company reported annual earnings of over $26 million. Beyond Covenant Eyes, there are literally hundreds of products and resources, books, websites, support groups, apps, software programs to help mostly young men avoid pornography. There are some porn addiction recovery resources like Fortify and NoFap that are not explicitly religious, but still evangelical Protestants, more than any other religious denomination, have dominated the pornography addiction recovery industry. In 2002, Craig Gross and Mike Foster, who were two young, hip, white evangelical pastors, founded what they dubbed XXX Church. The website advertised porn, sex, girls, guys on its homepage to invite visitors who maybe had no qualms about porn, but to read on and learn why they should avoid it. The organization now offers a software program that is similar to Covenant Eyes. It's called X3 Watch. One of its taglines is "Jesus loves porn stars." And today, a former porn performer, Brittany De La Mora, leads XXX Church along with her pastor husband. Together, they spearhead a project called Strip Church that ministers to dancers in strip clubs. They also attend the AVN, which is sort of the adult industry's Oscars, the AVN Awards each year to, spread their good news. Between 2016 and 2019, so over a period of 13 years, Pastor Craig Gross of XXX Church publicly debated the porn performer Ron Jeremy at universities across the country, and they pitted this event, porn pastor versus porn star. In one of these debates, Craig Gross started by saying, "I'm not about shutting down the porn industry. You have the right to view it. Still, the next time you're tempted, the next time you have a thought, you're visiting a porn site, I would just ask yourself why. Take a beat and just think about it." So evangelicals are well known for being cultural innovators, in the words of sociologists Shane Lee and Philip Sinitier. They've remained successful and salient in contemporary American culture, even when denominational church membership and attendance has declined. So what emerged in the late 20th century was a kind of spiritual marketplace where religions competed to produce innovative forms of worship and convince individuals that religion had a place for them. Evangelicals have been really successful in this marketplace because they are, as the common saying goes, in the world, but not of the world, meaning that they participate wholeheartedly in secular culture, even while clinging to conservative or traditional beliefs. And so this is what makes certain evangelical enterprises, Christian rock music, self-help, coffee shops and megachurches, so successful. evangelicals don't see this as cultural appropriation, but rather as a kind of cultural transformation. So Craig Gross on stage next to Ron Jeremy really epitomizes this trend. Today, Reverend Gross leads an organization called Christian Cannabis that promotes recreational marijuana as a spiritual practice. As an aside on Ron Jeremy, which some of you may know, in 2023, a judge found him mentally incompetent to stand trial for multiple counts of sexual assault. The sociologist Jeremy Thomas has traced how Christianity Today, which is the largest evangelical magazine in the United States, changed in its coverage of pornography, so that since the 1990s, an addiction framework has really come to dominate. Before the mid-1980s, most articles relied on what Thomas calls the narrative of traditional values to discuss porn. So articles tended to center on how pornography contributes to an overall moral decline of society, along with the disintegration of the nuclear family. In the mid-1980s, influenced by the feminist anti-porn movement, the narrative of public performer harm emerged. So this centers on how pornography harms women both as porn performers and also within broader society. And around the same time, Thomas names the narrative of personal viewer harm, which emphasizes the harm that pornography causes to individual consumers. This outlasts the public performer narrative and has indeed shaped the anti-pornography movement in the 21st century. So by the 1980s, evangelicals could no longer pretend that porn was a problem only outside of their communities. There were all these sex scandals involving televangelists, Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart. It seemed evidence for a bumper sticker that was sold at the time, the moral majority is neither. But instead of admitting defeat, evangelical leaders instead began acknowledging that pornography's consumers were also Bible-believing men, sometimes even women. Evangelicals confronted what they saw as the mistaken values and this market of sexual liberation that was making their way into evangelicals' lives and relationships. So evangelicals were able to create an industry and a culture that acknowledged how pornography harms marital relationships, personal well-being, but at the same time acknowledged how devout Christian men might also be tempted by it. Sociologist Samuel Perry describes this as a shift from offense to defense, to defend against pornography addiction, which has become perceived as a threat to evangelical men. And in some ways, these evangelical leaders were right. Protestant men are more likely than any other group, including those with no religious affiliation, to perceive themselves to be addicted to porn. Here's a graph from a survey conducted by one of Perry's frequent collaborators, the psychologist Joshua Grubbs. So it shows that men who attend church weekly are less likely to look at porn than men who attend church less frequently, but they're more likely to consider themselves to be addicted to porn. And by the way, you can also see how women who attend church weekly are also more likely than women who don't to consider their porn use a problem. It's beyond the scope of my talk today, but there are many gendered implications for porn addiction rhetoric. But for both women and men, several studies have found that religious commitment is actually a better predictor of perceived porn addiction than actual porn use. Okay, so what are we to make of the pornography addiction recovery industry alongside the anti-pornography, often calling itself anti-sex trafficking movement? To conclude, I'd like for us to recall an act of violence that happened almost exactly 4 years ago on March 16th, 2021. This is an image of the flowers and signs displayed in Atlanta on one of the anniversaries of this shooting. A white man murdered 8 people at 2 massage parlors in the Atlanta area. He told authorities that the motivation for his crime was that he was a sex and porn addict. He reportedly said he targeted the victims, including 6 women of Asian descent, whom he perceived as sex workers to remove, quote unquote, temptation. And he was headed to Florida next because, quote, they make porn there. The shooter was also a member of a local Baptist church. He had sought treatment for his sex and porn addictions at a nearby Christian facility called Hope Quest. So in the aftermath of these Atlanta shootings, anti-porn organizations, including NCOSE, released statements that condemned the shooter's crimes, that emphasize their commitment to protect sex workers from exactly this kind of violence. And yet the sex addiction treatment industry is embedded within the larger efforts led by religious conservatives to criminalize pornography and crack down on sex work. So anti-pornography activists who have the core belief that all sex work is inherently exploitative, which is the phrase used by Nkosi, coupled with their attachment to addiction rhetoric, really create what I think is a lose-lose for both sex workers and their customers. So men like the Atlanta shooter are led to believe that they consume porn or pay for sex because they cannot overcome their addictions. People in the sex industry are both victims in need of rescue, as the rhetoric goes, but they're also suppliers of these addicts' temptations, and thus tapping into some racist stereotypes. So this example shows how the logic of the anti-pornography movement, which centers around sex trafficking and pornography addiction, can be pushed and extended, and in this case, to really horrifying results. I think it also shows the interconnected web of the pornography addiction treatment industry, evangelical Christianity, and also the political arm of the anti-porn movement. So on the surface, efforts to eliminate both sex trafficking and pornography addiction appear to align completely with the mission of ATSA and its efforts to prevent sexual abuse. All of us can likely rally behind the idea that no one should be forced or coerced into servitude, sexual or otherwise. We should have compassion for those who feel like they're out of control when it comes to watching porn. And I think there are many important and legitimate critiques of pornographic websites and the companies that own them. In fact, sites like Pornhub are often a leading villain in both sides of the pornography debates. So many sex workers and their allies described Pornhub in particular as the kind of Amazon.com of porn. It maximizes profit for company executives at the expense of independent performers. So we might hope that criticisms for sites like Pornhub could be a place for common ground, perhaps an opportunity for productive dialogue over how to improve the lives of sex workers and their customers. But instead, both sex trafficking and pornography addiction rhetoric really aligns with conservative Christian beliefs about sexuality because those beliefs provide justification for pathologizing sex work and porn. And that's why I think it's all but impossible to disentangle anti-sex trafficking activism or pornography addiction treatment from the evangelicals who lead both movements. So they leave no room for improving the porn industry because there's no such thing as quote unquote good porn. Instead, their agenda requires that all of us conform to a distinctly conservative worldview. And that is where I will end. So I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for your time, and I will look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Kelsy. Trying to come on video here. There we go. Nope. I have so far one question for you, and the first one is, what would the feminist groups that were anti-porn say about OnlyFans?
That's a great question. So OnlyFans, for those of you who are not familiar, is probably the leading platform for cam models, which is sort of within this broader umbrella of the online sex industry. It's different than pornography in that it's typically interactive, and models are able to live stream performances and also adapt their performances based on what their customers or viewers request and pay for. So there's been a lot of critique about OnlyFans and how it contributes to sort of larger feminist arguments against pornography, that we see who makes a lot of money on sites like OnlyFans tend to conform to very strict conventions of beauty having to do with thin, white, feminine women's bodies. At the same time, it was a platform that was used by many of the sex workers I talked to as a way that they could really control the terms and conditions of their participation in the sex industry. So I spoke to one performer in particular who had started out in the industry by working with an agent and working for commercial porn shoots, and found those to be really exploitative, where she was doing things that she wasn't into, where she felt like she was being pressured from both directors and the agents to do certain kinds of work and wasn't adequately getting paid for that work. So OnlyFans was what she turned to produce what she described as a kind of art, that she was able to create content on her own terms. So I would say it's, as so many things in the sex industry, a kind of double-edged sword, in that there's both opportunities and also we see restrictions when it comes to that site.
Another question about feminists. What would feminists say in support of porn?
Um, I have a chapter in the book, it's called Come As You Are, where I detail my interactions with a feminist porn performer. Her name is Inka Winter, and she talks about how she found herself deciding to take things into her own hands as she was continually dissatisfied and disappointed with the porn that she was watching, and so decided she could do it better. She could make it differently. This is a legacy that dates back really to the 1980s, when women performers started saying, like, we should be both behind the scenes and in front of the camera. We should be able to write our own scripts. We should be able to edit content. So there's been, various sort of formal professional organizations that have advocated for women's roles within the industry. And the claim is that, women's sexual pleasure, the performance of it, is something that can be empowering and at the very least can be a legitimate form of work. So I talked to many sex workers who turned to this as an industry because they were caretakers, because they were caring for young children or aging parents, and this was a flexible form of work where they felt they could get paid more adequately than the alternatives that were available to them. So I think there's absolutely a sort of feminist case to be made in defense of porn, even if the commercial industry seems to foreclose some of the feminist possibilities, or it may seem.
How do you respond to critiques of your research that it is anti-religion or anti-Christianity?
I get critiques from all sides, which maybe makes me think I'm at some sort of sweet spot of, that nobody likes it. So I have, on the other hand, I have heard that I am too sympathetic, too supportive of Christian anti-porn activists. As a qualitative researcher, I spent a ton of time with people and listening to people. I think that you get to know them, and it's really hard to portray anybody as a villain or as a dupe or an idiot. Something actually that um, why am I blanking on Hustler magazine? Larry Flint wrote a eulogy of Jerry Falwell, and they became sort of strange friends later on in their life. And Larry Flint said that his mother said something to him at one point: the more time you spend with someone, the more likely you will find something there is to like about them. So that doesn't answer the question about Christian bias. I tried to depict my research participants fairly and accurately, and I do think people, can draw their own conclusions about my analysis. But just to say that the criticism has come at me in both ways, but from both sides.
Have you seen examples of legislation that does better to balance research, language, accountability, etc.?
This is tough. I think since the book has come out, there have been some professional organizations affiliated with the adult industry that have really gotten more heavily involved in legislative lobbying in ways that they hadn't in the past. So it would be interesting to follow those efforts. And so one of the things that has cropped up sort of around the time and after the book came out in 2023 are laws that require age verification on pornographic websites. The problem with these laws is they don't offer a strategy to implement age verification. And so the risk is that then websites would have to ask for driver's license numbers, social security numbers, some sensitive identifying information to confirm age limits. So most advocates within the adult industry have advocated that a better strategy is to have device level protections rather than requesting that these protections take place or at the burden of the websites themselves. So this is something that lawmakers, I think, have been listening to increasingly. So that would be my big takeaway, is to like listen to people within the industry, not just the executives who are owning the websites and not just folks who have a clear conservative position that opposes any form of pornography and sex work, and that's where sort of the most ground can be made.
Within your research, have you noticed any trends with adults with IDD and addiction to porn?
That's, I guess, a big question. So I'm going to sort of sidestep an answer to that question because part of my work, the book is called The Pornography Wars, and part of how I made the case to my university's IRB that I could do this work at relatively low risk is that I was talking to people who were already actively engaged in talking publicly about pornography. So the framing of my work is not about individuals who might consume porn and are not otherwise involved in activism. So I think there's a lot of really good and important work coming from psychologists, and maybe we could have sort of a list of resources or recommended readings that we could share after the webinar. So the framing of my work, I guess, is slightly different in that I'm not really able to answer that question.
Does the anti-porn movement distinguish between violent porn and non-violent and harm? Does qualitative research find a distinction?
The short answer to that question is no. So the anti-porn movement really treats pornography as a monolith, with the exception of some of the slippery slope arguments that you find in porn addiction rhetoric, that like there's some acknowledgement that there's like, oh, sort of more vanilla porn compared to more hardcore porn. There's one famous study that came out in 2008, maybe, that the anti-porn activists love to cite that looks at the prevalence of violence in online pornography, and that in the vast majority of those cases, women were receiving that violence and that they responded with either neutrality or with pleasure. That particular study comes from a content analysis that basically measured, was it present or was it absent? And there was no qualitative distinction between consensual BDSM, for example, and the most common form of quote unquote violence was spanking. So that was included. So I think this question is such an important one, and it points to the limits in our measurements when it comes to porn consumption and its effects, that we don't tend to ask what kind of porn people are watching. When I asked anti-porn activists if they have ever heard of movements within the industry, these have different names, but asked if they've ever heard of feminist porn, if they've ever heard of ethical porn, there was sort of shock and horror and sort of like, oh, these seem like oxymorons to them. They couldn't imagine that there would be such distinctions within the porn genre itself, which is, just sort of uniformly bad news.
Let's see here. Does the research show the more you look, the more you are looking for novelty, including more graphic images or child porn?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as far as I know, I would say that the research does not know, that we do not have really good measurements of not just when it comes to what the question discussing images or like for like illegal content. We don't know about cause and effect. This is so often because most surveys about porn use and whether or not it causes harm are cross-sectional, so they're conducted at a single point in time. So it's this kind of chicken and egg dilemma. We don't know, like there are some studies that have showed an association between men's consumption of porn and their likelihood of having misogynistic attitudes. This is slightly different than what the question is asking. But in that particular study, the authors say we really can't identify whether it's men's pre-existing attitudes that makes them more likely to look at pornography or if it's the other way around. So this is a really difficult question of measurement, I think, that is important for additional research.
Is there anything you can say on the growing use of AI in the porn industry and how that may open a sort of Pandora's box?
Oh gosh. Yeah, AI, I think, is concerning across all sides. I have heard the argument for people whose sexual interests are such that would get them involved in potentially illegal, abusive, violent behavior, that AI can be a way for them to experiment with those desires in a way that doesn't actually harm people. I think the counter to that argument is that AI does not come from a vacuum. It is not entirely removed from human people. So often AI is attached to actual living, real human beings, and the, deep fakes or the manipulation of actual images. So yeah, I would say that it's concerning for performers who fear that they might be, out of work, that already the internet has sort of decimated the industry as it was in, say, the late 90s or early 2000s. You can no longer make a living just by working in commercial porn alone, or that's very rare. So AI is concerning in that way. And then I think, of course, it's concerning to folks who are part of the anti-porn movement, just in that the proliferation of images will just be that much greater with those tools.
And I think we have time for one more question, and that is, do you have feedback or recommendations for clinicians working with persons convicted of accessing CSIM?
I am not a clinician, and so I feel like I am not best suited to offer feedback or advice in that regards. My sort of big takeaway advice for clinicians is to, really look deeply at the science that they might be consuming, because I think that scientific studies are touted often without providing details about methods, kinds of data, because so much of the anti-porn movement has established itself as one that is rooted in, health-based claims or science-based claims, that to be skeptical of information and knowing if there's any sort of political, religious, or other ulterior motives in getting advice for treatment, that's sort of the big takeaway, which isn't, I realize, any tangible feedback or advice for clinicians, but just to understand the broader context in which advice might be offered to you.
Well, Kelsy, thank you so much. This was very insightful and I think very important for our members to hear. As we wrap up here, I want to share my screen one more time. We have some additional upcoming educational opportunities. You can find them on atsa.com, and you can just scroll to the events calendar to see everything that is available. To get your CE credits, you can scan the QR code that is on the screen. We will also email this out, so if you can't scan it right now, that's totally okay. To complete the post-webinar exam and survey, you have until March 14th to complete that survey. After that, we will be emailing out certificates to those who have completed it. We also have this recording available, so if you need the recording, you can also let us know about that. Again, I want to thank Dr. Burke and for taking the time to be with us today. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a great weekend. Thank you so much.